Okay, I think we're good. All right, we should be good. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. This is our third session on CVI. And we're looking today at characteristics and evaluation of CVI. Before we really get started into the meat of today's lesson or session, if you're having any problem seeing any of the slide, or you need me to like move my picture of you guys around, just raise your hand or ask me to do that. I think that that does make a difference. So I know that having everybody's picture on there is a little bit distracting to some people. But that's kind of, I think, the way we're gonna set this up. The one that I recorded last week just has me on it. So anyway, and those are, if you wanna let people know, those are being recorded and uploaded to a YouTube channel that Tracy, an account that she started. I'm going to ask you though right now, can you hear me okay? Because there's a lot of background noise. I can shut the windows here. It's just, it's really hot in our room.
I can hear you fine, Jody.
Is that better?
Sound here is good, Jody.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I can hear you too.
Okay, good, thank you. Any questions that anybody has so far from our previous two sessions? Don't be afraid to ask along the way. So we're going to start with now assessment, which isn't necessarily something that you guys would be doing per se, but you would be involved in it. Kind of a unique aspect about CVI assessment is that it starts out with a screening, and the screening isn't really involving the child at all. It involves talking to the parents and the teachers and whomever else may be working with that child. So I think it's important that you do know about these different kinds of assessments. There's many more out there. These are right now what's most widely used in the United States, or that we'll be coming across, but there's other ones as well that are very good. And they're used as kind of, like I said, to start with, they're used as a screening. And then if enough red flags or enough answers are positive, then we actually go into the assessment component of it and delve more deeply. The actual assessment, you know, it can be quite a lengthy process. It takes, theoretically, you're to observe the child in their home environment, in their school environment, and also do like a learning media assessment with that and a function vision evaluation with that. So it can get to be really involved. What we're kind of talking about now in the classes is to get the ball started or get the ball rolling. We often will at least do the screening and gather as much information as we can. And then hopefully the parents will see fit to take that child to a medical doctor of some sort, so that then we can have the records and the medical background to go with, because otherwise, you know, the assessment really doesn't work without that. So with that being said, there's three main assessments that are used, and one is, some of you may have heard of this, Christine Roman-Lansky's cortical visual impairment. Now you notice that she calls it cortical vision impairment. She's kind of at odds a little bit with the other two assessments, as they are, see it more as a cerebral visual impairment. I think generally they all kind of are meaning the same thing. She just maybe has a little bit of a narrower view on it, but she also has kind of the most developed assessment tool available. So there's Dr. Gordon, who we've seen a lot of his video clips, the CVI inventory screening tool, and then Orbitus's Teach CVI, and that's also a screening tool. So first things first. The first thing we always do when we're looking at a CVI possible afflicted kid is getting information from parents and caregivers. Parents interviews are key to each one of these assessments. Why? Well, because parents know their child longest and best. And that old adage of listen to your parents, which some of us that are parents wish our kids really actually did that once in a while, but that is true. If we are to really get to know the child, they might be seeing, the parents might be, noticing things from birth that the child's not able to articulate, or we might not even see in our dealings with the child, but that parent can say, oh yes, I've seen my child do this and that, or I've noticed when my child is tired that this happens, or so on and so forth. So that's just, we get just stressed over and over on this point, is that parents and caregivers really need to be primary part of the team and very involved all the way through. So starting with Christine Roman-Lansky's assessment, this is what her book looks like. You may have seen this. You, again, don't have to run out and order this, but if you want a good book on assessment or visual CVI, this is one of the main ones, and it's by the American Foundation for the Blind, or AFB Press. This is the second edition. This is written in 2018, I believe. This would be the one to get over the first edition. There have been some significant changes made. Okay, I'm going to warn you up kind of up front. There's going to be some information overload for the next. This will be. I'm not showing any videos during this session. This is kind of a informational type of presentation all the way through. So we're going to start with this. Roman-Lansky's CVI characteristics. She has 10 of them. Okay. One of them, number 5, difficulties with visual complexity, is broken into 4 parts. And we'll get to that in a little bit. So the first characteristic, and it's called a vision behavior or visual characteristic, is the need for color, or just color. 2 is need for movement. 3, visual latency. 4, visual field preferences. 5, and the reason why this one's divided into 4 parts is because it's the most common and layered part of the characteristics. And this is difficulties with visual complexity. We're going to look at complexity in terms of objects and salient features. Does everybody know what salient features means? I didn't when we started, so let me give you an example. If you think about a cow and an elephant, okay, the salient features of each are the way that you would distinguish between them, the differences between them. We know that they're both animals, that they're mammals, that they have 4 legs. And so for many kids, a cow and an elephant might be the same thing. As their vision or their brain development matures, they'll start to be able to tell that the elephant has a long trunk, right? Or that the elephant is much bigger. The elephant is gray, that the cow is brown, that it has a smaller head, all of those kinds of things. So just any characteristic of an object that makes it unique or different is a salient feature. Then we're going to look at array of objects, of faces, and sensory complexity. The sixth one is light. Seventh is difficulty with distance viewing. 8 is atypical visual reflex. That's like the blink reflex. And I will say there that Christine Lansky's, her assessment is really the only one that looks at the blink reflex. 9 is difficulty with visual novelty. That's items that the child may not have seen before. And then the other characteristic is the absence of visually guided reach. And here's where really this is so interrelated to occupational therapy, visual motor types of things that I'm just so excited for our OT people to just become more aware of this. I think it's going to be really good for all of our kids. So now I'm going to break this down into each of the characteristics. We have color, and a child, depending on the phase that they're in, and I'll get to that in a minute, they may prefer an object with 1 or 2 colors. Oftentimes it's red or yellow. I don't know that there's any magical thing to that other than a lot of that might be how our brain, you know, McDonald's has chosen red and yellow, maybe for a reason. Our brain picks up on those colors more quickly. A red fire engine, you know, yellow flashing lights, but it's also the colors oftentimes used in young children's toys or Elmos or whatever you might use. And so kids will gravitate to that. They may also gravitate to bright and highly saturated colors that attract and maintain attention. Now, you're going to say, well, a lot of kids will do this, and that's right. But with kids with CVI, there's a definite preference here. And as the child develops and gets more visually sophisticated, the preferences will expand. It won't be just limited to 1 or 2 colors on an object. Next one is the need for movement. Now here we need to talk about movement in terms of its quality. Anything that does move, objects that move, wind-up toys that move, people that move, that's one kind of movement, but also shiny and reflective objects that mimic movement. So think of mirrors, think of pom-poms, think of mylar that the balloons are, that material that balloons are made of. Anything like that, and for any of us, generally, you know, we are quicker to see something that's moving than something that's not. If you're a deer hunter, a deer that is standing perfectly still is going to be much harder to see than one that is running. So that's kind of makes sense. Visual latency. We talked about this a little bit last time about the need for that child to have time to make a response. So not only is there a delay in seeing the object, so a delay in visual response, there's also a delay in understanding what is being seen. So if I see my hand, okay, that's one kind of visual response, but recognizing it, oh, okay, this is my hand. That's the second kind of visual recognition. And oftentimes there's latency in both of those. Here we have just an example of visual field preferences. So for whatever reason, oftentimes kids with CVI, the outer peripheral visual fields are a bit less sophisticated. They might be the ones that don't get impacted. They're more primal in nature. As we saw that the woman who could see the rain, it was the movement that she saw. Oftentimes a child will prefer a peripheral visual field and they may present with lower field difficulties. So that objects that are below, you know, the line of vision and down here. Now there you'll see kids, it might not be that they can't see down there. It might be that there's just neglect of that field. They don't look down there. They don't notice things from down there. And so that can be, again, taught to help those kids recognize objects in the lower field. And again, here, I would just ask that you think about maybe some of your students, you know, oftentimes kids with CVI, for whatever reason, tend to prefer to look out of the left and the side and kind of lower. So you'll see kids kind of looking, trying to catch things like this, especially if they have nystagmus and they have what's called the null point. That's a point at which they can see best at and kind of get their eyes to stop moving. Oftentimes it's in the left lower. And so you might see kids that are really look, especially lower functioning kids. Now, higher functioning kids, you know, a lot of these things won't even be noticed. Probably some of them, like I talked about the 15-year-old, but some of these won't be noticed until, you know, they're in school or, you know, as they start to read. Then things feel like things aren't really making sense, but we don't know why. All right, here we have difficulties with complexity, and this is the first one about objects and salient features. So a child with CVI would prefer probably solid plain colors. Now this is, again, probably lower functioning students at this point, and prefers simple patterns. Okay. This comes as, well, we'll get to that in just a second here. Difficulties with complexity and the array. Okay. So you can see here, this is almost like one of those, can you find it pictures, you know, can you spot the abacus or the blue ball or whatever. But when you see a picture like this, and a child with CVI is looking at a picture like this, they're just not able to distinguish the objects from this complex background. And they can't be distinguished from items around it. Parents will often talk about their child not being able to find an object in a pile of clothes. And that's hard, you know, if you have a pile of dirty laundry and you're looking for a face mask, you know, sometimes you have to do a lot of digging if you're trying to look for that specific thing. That's the same principle as this. Here's where, and it's kind of it's a difficult message, I think. It goes counter to a lot of what those of us who have gone through elementary education training have been taught, or through child development classes, that you really want to stimulate your child. So, you know, if you have your own children at home, or if you're especially in the lower grades, elementary, you know, you want to have things popping. You want to have, you know, color, and you want to have things that are making noise and things that are really stimulating the brain. And that has its place. It absolutely does. It doesn't so much with CVI kids, okay? They're just not able to sort out all that color, all of the, I'm trying to think of like, I'm just gonna try to think of a typical kindergarten or first grade room where maybe, you know, the letters of the alphabet are everywhere, and there's just lots and lots of signs of things that the teacher wants the child, you know, to notice, like colors and directions, or, you know, anything you can think of that would be in a younger student's environment. That is extraordinarily difficult for a child with CVI. And then that's where you might see the behaviors, because they're overstimulated and they cannot, it's frustrating. They just can't, they can't distinguish or isolate. And they don't understand why they can't, and they're oftentimes not able to articulate that. Kids with CVI often have a difficult time distinguishing faces. The first video that was in a foreign language, the girl kind of talked about what, a face that kind of first she would see the eyes, then the nose and the mouth, and then it would kind of take a while and it would come together for her. That's her. That's not what every person that has facial recognition difficulties goes through, but that's an example. Here's where I've had parents talk to me about their young children, and say, as a baby, this child did not make eye contact. It was like he or she was looking right through me, or I never felt like I really bonded with my child because they just didn't seem to be aware of me. Well, we're programmed, right? I mean, instinctually, most of us children, faces are some of the first things that we recognize. That's how we know our parents. That's how we bond. That's how we have social interaction. But kids with CVI, they don't have that. And that's where maybe this is one of the areas you can see it starts to lend itself to, that looks like an autistic child, because you'll see autistic kids that might have some of these same, they avoid eye contact, or they have difficulty with social cues. And that's where, kids are being diagnosed with autism when it may not be that at all. It may be CVI. Again, here the child may see parts of the face. They might see the nose, the eyes, the mouth, but they might not be able to put that all together. And voice may help facial recognition. So, if you're talking to a child along, they very well may get to know their mom's voice or their dad's voice, teacher's voice. Some people have a very distinctive voice. And here we have the last subpart of difficulties with complexity is the sensory part. And that's pretty much in a nutshell. This photo kind of shows what that CVI kid is feeling like. There's just little to no tolerance for competing stimuli, easily overwhelmed by sounds or touching. Again, this sounds a lot like autism, right? We have autistic kids that display this. It doesn't mean that a kid can't be both autistic and have CVI at the same time. They can coexist, but just these are things that we've been taught through this course to be more aware of, that there's such a high incidence of autistic diagnosis, which very well may be, but some of those may actually be CVI that's not being diagnosed or recognized, which I think is just fascinating. When you have a child that's looking like this, how effective do you think any learning or teaching is going to be with that kiddo? They're just trying to maintain barely. Okay. So, the goal is to get them out of that kind of mode and into a mode where they can receive and give information. Okay, now we go on to light. Oftentimes, especially lower functioning kids, are attracted to light or lighted objects. That's how you get their attention, is to maybe have a lighted moving object coming around. However, there's other ways too. Backlighting supports visual attention. What is backlighting? Well, backlighting is like, okay, let's look at your iPad or your smartphones or your, any of your phones. You can tell when the contrast isn't as much, with the brightness setting on the iPad or your iPhone, how much more difficult that is to see. But sometimes when it's lit up and there's more backlighting, then the contrast is better. And so then that supports you being able to see what's on your screen. iPads happen to be just generally an excellent tool for kids with CVI. Most kids with CVI respond very positively to the iPad. Apple does a nice job of accessibility anyway. but this kind of technology is, there's also light boxes where you can put different kinds of mats or screens or different things, and there again, that can help the child with that contrast or being able to distinguish. And then there also might be light sensitivity. They always will try to remember, advise teachers or parents that have children with CVI to start at least with their back towards the natural light. So like how I'm sitting is how you'd want a CVI kid to be sitting, with the window behind them and coming, onto the surface of what's in front of them, so that they're not looking into that light and there's not that competing stimuli for them. Sometimes, oftentimes, with having it just very dark, having the room pretty dark and having the lighting off, and then just having the item that you wanting that child to work with being lighted or being backlit, that may be the way to go. It can become that, what I would call extreme, that you want the child to be able to see just that object. We talk about complexity too, in terms of, blotting out extra sensory things, a trifold privacy folder to put around the child so that, they're not seeing everything else in the classroom. That way, your whole classroom doesn't need to be maybe redone, but that child is having their own little space. And black seems to be the preference. If you have a black trifold, then objects that are placed against that or within that area do show up to that child better. They can process and attend to that. Any questions? I just feel like I'm talking so much, and that's kind of part of today's thing, but any questions so far? Is this any new information for anybody, or do you guys all know all of this stuff? Some new information? Okay. Here we see difficulty with distance viewing. Now, oftentimes when we think of kids with vision problems, the first thing we want to say is, oh, let's make things bigger, right? Let's enlarge sheets because they probably have an acuity problem. They might have an acuity problem. Acuity is an ocular condition. It's an eye condition. You might be nearsighted or short-sighted. That's what that, or you could be farsighted and you have a hard time seeing things that are far away. Short-sighted is you have a hard time seeing things that are far away, but you can see things really up close. And nearsightedness, that's what that is. Farsightedness is when you can see things far away, but you can't see things up close. And so it's different than difficulty with distance viewing. You see this child right here who has this book up pretty close. I would say within probably 6 to 8 inches here. Well, the reason why is because the closer you get something up to you, the more it blots things out around you, and it becomes less complex, okay? Also, things that are spaced, if words or pictures are spaced farther apart from each other, it naturally becomes less complex. If you're teaching a child a math problem, just use one problem on one sheet of paper. That might be what that child can handle, okay? And then that's where the attention might come in, is just right here. It's not because they can't see out here. It's because this is where the brain is recognizing objects. Okay, it's different than acuity. It's different than them not, being able to see clearly. It's actually a brain where the brain is recognizing and how it processes complexity. In Christine Roman Lansky's, we talk about a delayed or no visual blink reflex. So there's two different, there's a visual threat. So, if something is thrust at the face, that's a threat reflex. A blink reflex is if you can show the child something, or you know, you don't actually touch the face with just a blink reflex, but the front reflex, you'd actually come in and, you know, that's a, if you're touching your nose and you're not blinking, you know, that's pretty significant generally. So again, she's the only one that really looks at the blink reflex in terms of assessment. Okay, difficulty with visual novelty. Here's a picture of Elmo. Child might have a favorite toy, and that's the only toy that that child might want to have. Now you can think that's a familiarity issue. They just are more comfortable. That's true, but then they're also ignoring items that are new. Why? Because their brain has formulated and understands what this image is, okay? But it hasn't formulated, it hasn't transferred that over or generalized that over to other objects. Again, that's a teaching thing. That's where children can learn to see objects that they weren't attending to before. You can, you know, introduce them, and oftentimes with kids with CVI, 3D objects are what they're going to recognize first. And it can be, depending on the level of where the child is at with the impairment. It can take a lot of time to transfer from a 3D object to kind of like an embedded. You've seen books that have like kind of pop-up books, so they might have something like embedded into the book where the child can kind of touch it, but it's not a fully developed 3D object, to then a flat photograph. That's a process, and that's a process that's oftentimes very difficult for CVI kids. And then there's an absence of visually guided reach. Okay? So kids are unable to look and reach at the same time. You might see a child look at an object, look away, and then reach. Okay? They may look away, and then reach. Okay, and there again, that's kind of something that OTs might see before other teachers or parents would probably see that, but that's kind of a hallmark characteristic of CVI. So those are the characteristics. Those are an explanation of those 10 characteristics just for Christine Roman Lansky. You take that information and we look at 2 different kinds of ranges in this assessment. We look at range 1, which tells us kind of across the CVI characteristics. Each characteristic is scored from a 0 to a 10. And since the CVI isn't ever really, it doesn't go away, there's rarely a 10. You can get kids up to a 9. It provides an overview of visual behaviors, and then it uses a scoring system, and it says it's resolved, which just means that they don't have problems with that really anymore. Or it can use a plus that, yep, we're seeing that behavior, a plus or minus. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't, or a minus. No, we're not seeing that behavior. And that can be like, prefers a 1 or 2 colors in an object. That's a pretty low functioning level. But if we're seeing that, then we would put the plus there. Okay, so that would be a component of the color characteristic. But maybe that child has now learned to tolerate or will look at an object with many colors in it. So then we would say that that's resolved. Okay, we're going to go on to a higher phase, which we'll talk about in a minute, and see where they land at with that characteristic in that phase. Okay, so there's range 1, which is across the CVA characteristics, and then there's range 2 that looks at within the CVI characteristics. So the second range, and they work together. Okay, they're kind of 2 pieces of the assessment. The range two assesses how each characteristic interferes with functional vision. It uses a scoring system of 0, 0.25, 0.5, 0.75, and 1.0 for each characteristic. 0 means that they're not doing it. 1.0 is that they're doing it all the time, okay? And then a composite score is compiled. And so you have a range 1 score and a range 2 score. And they should, if you're doing it correctly, they should match pretty close within the same, like 4.5 to 5, you know, so. And that's one thing that, like in my classes, we've had to watch a lot of videos, which is not always the easiest to assess over a video. But you know, we're to assess and do the across the characteristics, and then do the within the range 2, and then hopefully those will match up pretty well. And then our score is supposed to match up in totality with the instructor's score. All right, so when those scores are added up, they're put into phases. So remember when I talked about the range was from 0 to 10? Okay, this is how it's then kind of organized. Range 0 to 3 is your bottom, your base. That's the lowest functioning. That's called building visual behavior. You're just starting to teach visual behavior. Now, again, we don't get a lot of some of these kids in our school because maybe they're at the N. Carlson Center, okay? However, we may get some of these kids. It just depends on, you know, where they're at. Phase 2, we'd see a lot more kids generally in our population here with range 3+ to 7. And here we're starting to integrate vision with function. We're starting to be able to not only see things and perceive them, okay, recognize them, but using them. Oh, how does this, I see a water bottle. I know what that's used for. So we're integrating vision with function. Phase 3 is ranges 7+ through 10. And then this is just becomes more of a refinement of the remaining CVI characteristics. These phases ideally should help plan programming. They should help us with setting goals. They should help us match strategies and implement interventions. We're not getting into that a lot this time. I know as teachers, that's what you guys are going to really want to hear more of. What can we do to help, right? So we will get to that. All right. This is another look at the phases in just a different format. Phase 1 is looking. This is the earliest phase where a child is just beginning to use their vision for looking at objects. It is important to teach children specific characteristics of an object, such as color, shape, and size. Again, those salient features. Range 1 and 2, there's minimal visual response. That child might just prefer light, okay? And some of these kids are profoundly impaired, okay? Stage 3 to 3+, there's a little bit more consistent visual response. We get these kids into phase 2, and again, you know, the time between phases could be months, could be days, it could be years. It just depends on how that child progresses and how we as teachers kind of find what motivates them. As Dr. Dutton talked about, you know, how is the brain thinking, and, you know, we need memory, we need recognition. I can't remember what the third thing you even said at this point, but those, you know, these are all intertwined with these progression of visual behaviors. Phase 2 then is looking with function. At this middle phase, children begin to learn to use their vision to do something. Here's where we might see switches working, you know, that type of thing. This can include looking at an object and reaching toward it, by using switches, or to play adaptive computer games. Again, just simple things like a spoon, what is that used for? A fork, what is that used for? Range 3 plus to 4 is you're getting consistent visual responses. Range 5 to 6 is the vision is used during functional tasks. And 7 to 7+, here we're finally looking at objects with curiosity. Okay. Phase 3 is visual, and they're calling it resolution. At this phase, a child is becoming better about using their vision for daily activities, and the specific characteristics are becoming less pronounced. You're slowly eliminating visual supports that progress vision. You're able to take those things away. So now maybe they're able to be in a room that's a little busier. Range 7+ to 8, they begin to visually inspect objects. And range 9 to 10 is really using vision in a normal and functional way. All right, so we've seen quite a bit from Dr. Gordon Dutton on his videos. Again, I would really encourage you, and I'll have a slide of that at just in a couple minutes here, of resources, but CVIScotland.org. Honestly, if you're interested in this stuff, you can just spend hours and hours looking. There's just so many neat resources on here. He has developed an inventory, okay, and his inventory is more brain-based. So as remember, he talked about the different parts of the brain, the occipital lobe, the temporal lobes, the parietal lobes, the frontal lobe, okay? They have different functions, right? And there's 2 streams that have been mainly discovered how the brain works. The dorsal stream, think of like a dolphin. The dorsal fin is the one on top. That's the aware system, what we call the aware system, where kids have an awareness, or how things move or where they're at in space. That's the dorsal stream function. I don't know if I put that on there. I don't think I saw that, but that's called, and the other one that kind of comes this way is the ventral system. He talked about that occipital lobe and then things coming down, and he called it, remember if he talked about that V5 location, that's known as the what system. And that's where the brain is recognizing objects, what things are, faces. And so this is where we're going to see a lot of issues with complexity, okay? We're going to see issues here with movement and space. We're going to see issues here with objects, complexity, okay? He has 51 questions, and you sit down and you do this with parents or students, okay? I think I might have copied one of mine off and sent it down maybe with Lindsay, but they might ask such as, does your child often stumble over objects on the floor? Does your child often get stuck at the top of the slide? If he's trying to seek information and evidence about visual fields, okay, that lower field especially is kind of a red flagship type of a thing. And also about visual attention, where are kids noticing things? He also, as you can see, is a little bit different than the previous assessment. He looks a lot at movement and that dorsal stream, what we would call perception of movement, okay? Do things, if they go by too fast, the kids miss them, okay? If a child is about to cross a street, does he just not notice cars coming by? That becomes, a real safety issue. And that's maybe one of his questions, I can't remember on that inventory. Difficulties with visual complexities, that's the ventral system. That's the one that's coming kind of processes under, okay? Visually guided movement, here's where the people in our class that are OTs, speech language, really will notice visual guided movement. There can be difficulties with both the upper and the lower limbs. So your arms are upper, obviously your legs are lower limb precision. So That's where that visually guided reach, maybe that's not happening. And that, it's hard to tell if that's it can be seen as a dorsal because it's movement, but they also have to be recognizing, if the object is too complex. So that affects kind of both of those systems at the same time. And then the issue of visual recognition. He asks questions about that. And I think that Gordon Dutton's inventory is just, it's awesome. It's easier to use. It's shorter. The scoring on it is either yes or no. And, and you just talk with the parents, and there's things on there that if the parents are, there's kind of a cutoff. If there's like more than 11 yeses or something, then it's like, that's the threshold to go on and say, then we need to look at more, more assessing here that child might have CVI issues. He is just so profoundly brilliant and has done so much of his life's work on CVI that anything that he's done, and he pretty much, is the force behind CVI Scotland.org. Really, you can learn a lot. I just can't say that enough. And I wish I had like an example here of his inventory. I don't, and I apologize for that. But you can look on CVI Scotland, or I can provide that in our next session as well. Okay, another screening tool is Els, that's her name, Els Orchidus. It's a female, her first name is Els. And it's called Teach CVI, okay? And this is like it's a collaboration, almost like a project. They call it the Aramus Project. And here you can see that it's www.teachcvi.net. And this is more like Gordon Dutton's inventory, except it maybe is a little more detailed, and it breaks it up into age ranges. So there's a screening for, I think, 0 to 3 or 4. And then there's a screening from 4 or 5 to, I think, about 13. And then there's one from ages 13 on. So this is another really, really good resource. This picture right here, I don't know if you can see this. I think I cut this picture off, but this is what was drawn by a 5-year-old girl with CVI. This is what her home, you can see the stairs probably right in here, people, windows. This is how she perceives her house. Okay. Now, we need to take just a couple seconds and think that because a child might draw, and Patty, I'm going to speak to you right here. You can see a young child that's going to draw a picture like this. That doesn't mean they have CVI, right? It means that they just don't, their visual skills haven't developed yet. Their perception, their brain is still developing. Now, as a 5-year-old, and this is how she's drawing, yeah, it might, because of how scattered this is, it might give you pause to say, she might not be seeing things quite in the same spatial types of form that other kids are. Okay. Anybody have any questions so far? I know this is really it's a heavy duty, lots of information. Okay, so the screening list for each CVI phase, and they also recognize the phase, they just call it CVI 1, CVI 2, and CVI 3. It's the same models pairs up with the one I first showed you of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Same basic concept that they recognize that kind of across the board. So that's nice. There's a scoring list for each CVI phase. Again, it's really user-friendly. It takes a little more time because it has a section for background information, which is really helpful. You get more of a feel of the child's medical background, family background, home environment, any of those things that, especially when you're first seeing a child for the first time, those things help us discern kind of where a child is at in terms of their functioning level. Then there's a parent interview, and this has a rating scale for each question. And I just put in here, 1 means never, 2 is occasionally, 3 is frequently, 4 is always. Again, it's kind of a scale. So
Jody, I have a question.
yeah, yep.
This is Bobby.
Yep.
So when you look at starting the screening tools, is there one that you kind of tend to start with and go to a more complex one? Or if you're suspecting it, where do we call you in and then you start doing some of that background?
Yep, that's generally the way we would probably do that. Bobby, that's a really good question. It's not that other people can't do those, but when you haven't had the training and the parents are asking questions, well, what does this mean? You're probably not as able to say, well, this means that they're having difficulties with their dorsal strain. Means they're having difficulty with complexity. Those are the kinds of things that, at least, I've been trying to learn a lot through these courses. So yeah, if you suspect that a child would have CVI, what I would do is probably come in and meet with the parents or the caregivers, whoever that is, or the teachers, anybody that works with that child, and sit down, not with the child. If they want to play someplace, that's fine, but you sit down with the child and do this interview process. Personally, I would probably start with Gordon Dutton's, the 51 questions, because they're quick. That's something that a parent can probably do without anybody needing to guide them. It's a check, yes or no. Okay. This Teach CVI screening tool, again, it's a screening tool, right? So it's not an assessment tool. This is the next thing that I would probably go to in that same session, maybe, or maybe I'd send the Duttons home with them, or they could do that and bring that back. So we could look over that together at that initial session. And then when they came back, then we could go through quickly the Duttons thing and see if they've checked more than, X amount, yes. And I would be like, okay, then I think it's worth looking a little bit deeper into this. Let's look at this Teach CVI screening tool that's a little bit more in depth. And then this looks too at the visual behaviors, not all of the same things that the first one did, but it does look at color. Again, complexity, we're going to see it over and over again, that's a huge part of CVI. Visually guided reach is in this one as well. And then the visual recognition, the visual attention, and visual field. And, again, if they're all nevers, well, then something else might be going on. We can do these screening tools and then take that information and give to the parent and say, okay, this is what we're looking at so far, and observing, some. But until that child goes to a neurologist or an ophthalmologist, we can't really go on to the assessment part of it, because in order to assess that child, we need those reports. For me to even do a functional vision eval on a kiddo, I need to have an eye doctor's report before I do that. That child should be seen by an optometrist first. Okay. Does that answer your question, kind of the steps, how that goes? Okay. All right. And again, you can look at these. You can print these off. If there's no copyright on them, at least that I saw, you can print these off of that. And I'll give you the resources here now. So cviscotland.org is, I've talked about that many times. cvisociety.org.uk that has, it's really interesting because it has some more personal stories, parents, a lot of resources for parents, and it has several different people's accounts of how their child was discovered to have CVI and the processes that they went through, and all different ages and stages. And I think that's really good. Perkins.org, that's right here, in the United States and Massachusetts. And then there's a component of that. You just want to go right to perkinselearning.org. There's a ton of, well, Ellen Maisel is the CVI coordinator for Perkins, okay? And she's one of the instructors for my classes, and she's like a walking encyclopedia. So she decided to start sessions kind of for TVIs, which is native teacher visually impaired, but anybody can watch these. They're called CVI for the TVI, okay? And they're a webinar, and she has one a month, and they go over different topics. And if you want to search through that, she has a lot of really good information. teachcvi.net is the screening tool and that information that we were just on. And then amazingly, YouTube, if you get on YouTube and search CVI, you'll find a lot of neat videos. Obviously, you can Google CVI and get a lot of information that way as well. But these are just an example of some really, and once you get into these, it can refer you on to other sites as well. So we are at 4:28. Powered through that. Is there, do you guys have any questions at this point? So next time, I haven't quite decided. We won't, next week is Easter Monday. We won't be meeting Easter Monday. So the next time we'll be meeting is, let's see, meeting. Sounds okay. I want to look here.
On the 12th?
April 12th. Okay, so we'll have a session on the 12th and on the 19th. If you want more than that, I can do more. If, we can be flexible with this as well. What I challenge you to do is kind of, again, look at some of your own kiddos that you're working with. The next part, I'm thinking that I'm going to take one of the case study students that we had and show you a couple videos of that student, and then go through how to apply strategies to an individual student who has certain characteristics. And we'll start looking at that, implementation and how to build in goals and programming for those kids. So anyway, you guys are attentive audience. I don't know if you're, hopefully not boring you too much, but
Jody,
yes.
I know that you're recording these and sending them out, but is there a way to get like the PowerPoints that you're doing?
Yeah, Bobby asked about that too. I am going to
Oh, I
try
must
to
have
do
missed
that. When I get, yeah, I will, I'm sure that I can email that. It's going to be it's going to be lengthy, but I think,
Oh, okay.
I'm up to right now about 90 slides.
Oh,
So it's big, but I can maybe do it in parts too, like how I went through it and do that. So I'll try to work on that in the next 2 weeks, and then we can, because it's nice to have that information, where you can have it and download it if you want.
You could probably upload it to OneDrive.
Okay. I could do that.
Then you wouldn't have to worry about what size it is for emailing it or anything.
Okay, good idea. Thank you. Thank you. Well, as you can see, there's just a wealth of information. There's a lot to know. It's a lot more complex than I think, we realize. And it's just changing all of the time. So like I said, some of the things that I learned last semester, they're already saying, oh, no, we're going to tweak on that. So it's evolving quickly. All right. Have a good Easter, everybody. And thanks for your time. Appreciate the good questions and suggestions.
Happy Easter.
Okay, see you.
See you, Jody.
See you, Robin. It's good to see you.
Have a good Easter, okay?
You as well. Thank you.
Yeah. I'll text you sometime. I think I could talk to you.
I'm going to stop recording this so I get this.
Yeah, we'll chat soon.
Okay, sounds good, Robin. Take care.
Yeah. Bye.